Good evening. As I close out my time at Dartmouth as a Perkins Bass Fellow, I want to thank the Rockefeller Center for the exceptional opportunity they have given me to be here on several occasions during the last year to meet and exchange ideas with students and faculty. There are a lot of talented people on this campus. And I have a very unusual connection to Perkins Bass that made my experience here all the more special. Perkins Bass was born in East Walpole, Massachusetts, a small town southwest of Boston, and for years served on the board and CEO of a company that owned the Bird and Son Mill in East Walpole. My grandfather, who emigrated from Ireland, worked his way up to be a shop supervisor in that mill in East Walpole. And like Perkins Bass, my own father was born in his home in East Walpole. So I have a lot of childhood memories of that town and of that mill. The mill was located less than half a mile from my grandfather's house. So each time I drove here this past year up to Dartmouth, somewhere along Route 89, I caught myself replaying a lot of those childhood memories of East Walpole. And I realized that I had stood on my grandfather's shoulders, pretty broad shoulders as I remember them, in being chosen to honor Perkins Bass and his distinguished public service. My grandfather, by the way, never graduated from high school. So I would think somewhere along 89 that he'd be pretty proud of his grandson up here honoring the former CEO of the company where he worked and where he spent most of his working life and interacting with students at Dartmouth College. That would seem surreal to my grandfather. And I wasn't all that sure what I should talk about today, but finally decided I should talk about my own public service, not because it is particularly noteworthy or more important than someone else's, but because it tested and challenged me in personal and professional ways I could never have imagined. It changed me, and it made me stronger and in many ways wiser. My 15 years on the Hampshire Supreme Court gave me an exceptional privilege, a genuine privilege, to do justice in the lives of others as best I could discern it. But those same years taught me how important it was to be steadfast in whatever public service I accepted and not to let others deter me from serving or continuing to serve, regardless of the discomfort their actions were causing me and my family. I don't share my story with you today because I don't want you to serve in public life. I do. I hope that the unparalleled rewards of public service will attract some of you for at least a portion of your adult lives. Public service is never easy. I used to hear people say that. I never understood it, but I do now. It's never easy, but it is always important. And given the tumultuous and uncertain times in which we live, the public sector could make good use of your integrity, intelligence, and idealism. But I do hope my story this evening will enlighten you on the potential perils of public life. I've never talked about it in any public forum, although I did testify about it in a public forum. But this seems a good and meaningful opportunity to speak about it. To give you some context of me and who I am, let me give you a brief history of my own aspirations for public service, because I believe that all of us are essentially the sum total of our life experiences, as well as the stories, experiences, and character of those who help guide us and mold us. But we can also be shaped by those who inspire us, by those whose lives seem larger, more selfless, more noble than our own. All of that would prove true in my life. My role models, I realize now, were the reason I never left my post on the court when public service became almost unbearable. I was born in the fall of 1947. It's hard for me to believe that. It's true. The war to end all wars was over. Israel was on the cusp of becoming a nation. The United States was building and rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan. The United Nations was 2 years old. Frank Sinatra, and Frankie Lane topped the charts. Commercial television was only in 44,000 American homes. A car cost $1,500, and you could own your own house for $13,000. All things seemed possible as America's greatest generation returned home to build the largest and most inclusive middle class in world history. My parents were part of that middle class. But there were real problems in America when I was born. Segregation was common. Lynchings were tolerated. Hard to believe that. Opportunities for women outside the home were few. And no one in 1947 would have publicly declared that they were gay without paying a high price. America still had a lot of growing up to do in 1947, but I wouldn't know that for many years to come. Because of my mother's intense interest, my high school educated mother, her intense interest in the world beyond our town's borders, I began to understand at an early age that politics mattered, and that some politicians seemed to focus mostly on those who needed a handout, while others thought that what was good for business was good for everyone. But in my childhood eyes, they all seemed very honorable and well-intentioned. My mother believed, by the way, that Franklin Roosevelt was a near saint. My father believed he was a saint, and that all we had to do was to pay attention to the world around us. However large or small that world was, we had an obligation to be involved and engaged. And it was our obligation to help people who were not as lucky as we were. That was drummed into me as a child. I had no idea who those people were, by the way. I didn't think they lived in my neighborhood. Some of them did, as it turned out. But my mother seemed very worried about them, really concerned about them, and so I thought I should too. I can remember as a child overhearing relatives telling stories of the Great Depression. They had experienced it. Of people they knew who lost their jobs and their homes, of going without, people who lost almost everything they had, and some people lost their dignity, which is the hardest thing to lose. I also remember my grandmother's stories about her trip to America all by herself when she was 16 years old. And she told that story with a bit of an Irish brogue, although she had never returned to Ireland. She held on to the brogue. And we hear those stories on Thanksgiving evenings in East Walpole, sitting around the table with aunts and uncles. I love those nights. I remember how grateful my grandmother was to be here in the United States. I was kind of surprised she hadn't been born here in the United States. But whatever my family's path, it was clear to me we did not arrive here on the Mayflower. That much I knew. I remember as a child, a senator from Massachusetts by the name of John F. Kennedy winning the nomination, or almost winning the nomination, for vice president in 1956. I was mesmerized by what was ever on television. I was 9 years old. My mother and I watched almost every single minute of that convention. My mother talked to me in those days about Al Smith and prejudice against Catholics and against the Irish. Kennedy was Catholic, she told me. That seemed important to her, so it became important to me. After Senator Kennedy won the presidency in 1960, I was 13. I was elated. I stayed up all night long with my parents watching the electoral map and waiting for the dead people to vote in Chicago. That was the story. When Kennedy was declared the winner, my mother actually cried. It's history, she declared in the joy of our small living room at 3 in the morning. The Catholics and the Irish had fought hard to be accepted. They had finally achieved it, she told me. She was so proud that night. Well, I had no idea what that history was, and couldn't imagine why my grandparents, were lovely people, would have been treated badly. I accepted that they must have been, or could have been. I was glad John F. Kennedy won too. I was proud to be Catholic and Irish on that November night. I wasn't sure why I was, but I was very proud. I knew something important had happened. I watched John F. Kennedy's inaugural address on my black and white television that cold January day. Kennedy was so much younger than Dwight Eisenhower, who looked like my grandfather. And Kennedy was so charismatic. He called on all of us to lead, to make a difference, to put our nation's interests ahead of our own. And I wanted to follow him. I was 13 years old. I wanted to do something important in public service, whatever that might be. He somehow made it matter. My grandmother, by the way, wanted me to be a priest, but I didn't want to learn Latin. I didn't want to be an altar boy, so I knew that wasn't my route. Public service seemed a better bet if I ever had the opportunity, so I set my sights on it without any idea whether it would ever be possible, and knowing nothing of its challenges or its price of entry. Just a few months later, when I was in the 8th grade, I actually met President Kennedy in the Rose Garden at the White House. It's a long story, but it changed my life. It was April 17th, 1961. As it turned out, it was the very morning of the Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion of the island of Cuba, and Kennedy's worst day as president. But he still met with us. He was the most handsome person I had ever seen before or since. It was like meeting your hero. He was extraordinary. And so he walked around, there were about 30 of us in the Rose Garden, and he came over to me, extended his hand, and asked me my name. I still remember it. I think I blacked out. I really do. I don't remember. And my parents were there, and I said afterwards, I said, did I say anything? My mother seemed pretty proud. She said, no, you were great. You introduced yourself to him and told him you were delighted to meet the president. But whatever happened there, I remember it was like yesterday to me. And I didn't wash my right hand for a long time. For a long time. But the memory of it never washed away. Never washed away. In the decade that followed that amazing moment at the White House, I began to grow and come to terms with an America I never knew existed. The television images I saw at that young age of barbaric attacks on unarmed and peacefully marching African Americans in several southern cities were just profoundly disturbing and frightening to me. Civil rights workers were sometimes killed, and many were under constant threat. I thought they were extraordinarily brave people, and I wasn't sure I would have that courage. I admired them. They chose to march to make a difference, to change not only their own lives, but most probably the lives of people they would never meet. And they did it at great personal risk. I remember as a child seeing burned out pictures of a Baptist church where 4 young girls were killed one night in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. They were my age. And their crime was they were African American, and the Klan killed them. I remember the image of Governor George Wallace standing in defiance of the federal government at the University of Alabama. But James Meredith, the African American student, was ultimately enrolled there under the watchful eye of the United States Attorney General in the presence of federal troops and federal marshals. I didn't see that in my town. But my town wasn't an integrated community either. In the span of 5 years, I witnessed with crushing intensity the unimaginable assassinations of the 3 people I most admired in public life. President Kennedy. My mother cried for 4 days. I cried for most of that time. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. Those people, in my mind, as a young person, stood for inclusion, tolerance, and progress on many fronts. Ignorance-driven hate had killed them, but could not eradicate, for most of us, what they stood for, what they were trying to accomplish. What I admired most about them is they never backed down. But amidst the sadness and insanity of those years, I also saw progress. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the beginning of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, brought hope to people and places where it had not existed. The March on Washington, which I watched from my television set, still black and white, began decades of change in civil rights in the United States. And in the election of an African-American president of the United States more than 40 years later. The forces of moral change, once unleashed, go where they will and almost never follow an easy or predictable path. It would prove a very long and difficult journey from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma to the U.S. Capitol where Barack Obama was sworn in. I would have been nowhere else on that morning but on that mall. My mother wasn't alive then, but she was with me. And I knew she'd be proud that I was there. It was a bitter cold and clear day that January in 2008. I stood there with 1,500,000 of my closest friends. And I felt an obligation just to be there, just to witness it. And there was a fellow standing next to me in the crowd with his 6 or 7-year-old daughter. They were both Caucasian. And he was explaining to her, I wished I had been able to record it. He was explaining to her why this day would change her life. And he did it in such eloquence, in the language of a third grader. It was powerful. And he was right, too. And I realized that morning as I was standing there, it didn't just happen. Barack Obama didn't just appear and suddenly the sky opened. It was the courage of politicians, the unrelenting resolve of African Americans, their basic courage and perseverance, the tenacity of lawyers, and the strength of enlightened legislators and judges, and the involving moral courage and tolerance of the American people had made change possible. Without lives committed to the common good, that journey from Selma to Barack Obama raising his right hand would not have been possible. And so those years really intensified my interest towards public service. 2 years after I graduated from law school, President Nixon was impeached for violating the trust of the American people and a few criminal laws along the way. He left office after the impeachment votes and before the trial. He was, in many ways, Richard Nixon, an exceptional president. He opened China to America, but his imperfections as a person ultimately consumed his presidency. And so it was a sad and profound day for my relatively young eyes to see that helicopter lift off the South Lawn after he had waved a salute goodbye to the American people. President Ford took over, and President Ford was out of central casting, and the United States can never repay their debt to him because those times seemed frighteningly hopeless for the American government, and he righted the ship. Little did I think as I watched Nixon that day in 1974, as he lifted away, that I would one day be subject to an impeachment investigation myself, that my ethics would be publicly questioned in televised hearings that were also carried live on statewide radio, that my professional life would be subject to negative front-page treatment full of unfounded speculation and moral righteousness that seemed unrelenting, that my many colleagues in the bar would fall silent in the face of false accusations and negative editorials, that I would ever feel as alone and misrepresented as I was during those days in 2000. All of that would have seemed surreal to me in 1995 when Governor Merrill nominated me to our state Supreme Court, but it became destructively real for me and my family. I'd never thought about being a judge, to be honest. Wouldn't have been on my list of top 10 things to do or to be. I love being a trial lawyer. And I thought if I were to do public service, I'd try to do it in some elective way or some appointed office. Judging seems so removed to me from the intersection of life and people and politics that I so enjoyed. It seemed very isolating and structured. It held no attraction for me at all. But when Governor Merrill offered it to me in 1995, I didn't say no. I guess I saw it as a unique opportunity that would not come twice. It wasn't a life sentence. I could leave if I didn't like it. I told the governor that. He said, "You'll like it." He was right. But it was a public service of a kind I'd never considered. So I proudly took the oath of office in the Supreme Court courtroom in November 1995, and my mother, then 18 months a widow, confined to a wheelchair, was in their courtroom that day. And it was a pretty cold, chilly day. A lot of my friends and family were there to witness the oath, and my mother cried throughout the whole process. I'm sure now, as I look back, that in her life journey, which had not been easy, my oath on that court was proof positive to her that Irish Catholics were moving. I wish my father could have witnessed it. I know my mother wished that too. And I'm sure that explains some of her tears that November morning. To my surprise, I adjusted quickly. I loved the new job. I loved the challenges. Every case was fresh and new, and there was something to do and to evaluate. And so even though I was removed from the spontaneity of my former life, I liked judging. It had its own unique rewards and satisfactions. One thing I found out, if you're on the state Supreme Court, everyone thinks you're smarter and funnier than you really are. So that was pretty nice. I did like that part. And after 5 years on the court, I was actually beginning to understand the job and its responsibilities. I was satisfied that I was learning the craft of being an appellate judge. And I'd really grown to love the job. And then February 2000 arrived. Changed my whole life. It was a Friday. It was just another Friday in a too long New England winter. And there was nothing exceptional about the day when it began, but it would later be dissected and analyzed by others in a very painful and public process for months to come. It would soon be the principal topic of 23 days of public hearings by the House Judiciary Committee in Concord, New Hampshire. It would lead to the resignation of one of my colleagues on the Supreme Court and rock the institution of our state Supreme Court to its core. It was also the reason I stepped down from the bench in February and didn't return until July. It seemed hard to judge others when you were being judged at the level I was being judged. One of my colleagues on the Supreme Court, someone I considered a friend, I'd known for a long time, he arrived at the court before I did, was in the midst of a pretty messy divorce. It became very public. Both he and his wife were lovely people, they were high-powered people, and their marriage had just imploded. So it was very hard on him. I saw him most days, and he was wearing that around, it was obvious. And his case was now on appeal to our Supreme Court, the divorce case. It had been tried, and they were appealing it to the court. And obviously all of us sitting on the court, his colleagues, recused ourselves. We weren't going to hear his divorce case. So a substitute Supreme Court would have to be impaneled to hear that case. And the Chief Justice, then Chief Justice, would appoint those people to serve. So I gave it no thought. It wasn't part of my day-to-day. And then on that Friday, February, all the judges were seated in the conference room. We'd have conferences periodically to talk about cases. administrative issues, so we were all seated in the large conference room. 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the Chief Justice came in last and sat down and spontaneously announced that he had appointed the panel for Justice Thayer's divorce appeal. And I was reading briefs and reading memos, and it didn't involve me. I mean, it didn't concern me. But he reported it in a very matter-of-fact way. He wasn't soliciting comments, he was just reporting it. And so I was reading, and I heard it, but I didn't much care, and I wanted to go on to the next item. It was a little awkward. And almost instantly after the chief finished speaking, my colleague, whose divorce was at stake, blurted out that one of the 5 judges the chief had appointed couldn't possibly be fair to him, whatever that relationship had been in the past. Another colleague in the room added his displeasure at that same choice. The chief got up and left the conference room. And I had no idea where he went, but I knew what I just heard was not appropriate at any level. The Chief Justice returned a few minutes later and told us that he had checked with the clerk of court, that the order making the appointment, including that judge that was questioned, the order had gone out, the panel was set, and it would remain set. And then we went on to our business. But I was concerned by what I had just heard, and viewed in its worst light, those comments, specifically by the judge whose divorce was this day, but even the other, could be seen as an effort to influence a judge in an ex parte way. I mean, that's unethical, and it may be criminal. Can't do that. The good news was that the original panel that the chief had appointed remained appointed, but that doesn't mean there wasn't an issue. But it seemed to me there was an ethical lapse and potentially a violation of criminal law. What was really troubling to me is I knew those people. I worked with them. And I knew that nobody acted with malice, no one acted with premeditation. These were honorable people who dedicated years of service to the people of our state. They were colleagues of mine. I liked them. I admired them. It was so spontaneous and unfortunate. It was driven largely by my colleague's pain and his divorce. I know he didn't think about what he was doing, he just reacted. I knew it had never happened on the court before, and it hasn't happened on the court since, but it did happen once. And so after sleepless nights and phone calls to people I respected, some of them former justices on our court, I said to the Chief Justice, we need to hire outside counsel to advise us what we should do. And so a few days later, and about a week or so after the event, having met with counsel, we made a report, a group report, a court report, to the Judicial Conduct Committee of the Supreme Court, which is comprised of lawyers and lay people and some judges, not judges from our court. And not saying somebody did this wrong, somebody did that wrong. We said, this is what happened. But we want to bring it to your attention and you can sort through it. The clerk of our court, with whom I had spoken, he hadn't been in the room. He had made his own report a couple of days before we did. And so we then suspended our colleague, whose divorce was on appeal. We suspended him with pay until the Judicial Conduct Committee could conclude whatever it was going to conclude. And so it suddenly became public, especially so when he sued us, all of us, on the court, in the federal court in New Hampshire, and they transferred it to Rhode Island. Federal judges in New Hampshire knew everyone too well, they couldn't rule on it. The Judicial Conduct Committee, apparently believing there had been a potential for a criminal violation after they read the report, they made a referral to the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, who investigated what had happened. We were all called over to the AG's office one at a time to describe what we had seen, heard, done, and witnessed. And he was about to convene a grand jury to see if he could secure an indictment against my colleague whose divorce had been pending on appeal for his conduct in that conference room. It was surreal to me. And so my world that I'd worked so hard to build was spiraling away from me. One day, while this was going on, I was still working, and I looked out my window. I looked out on the front lawn of the court, and there was an ABC News truck and an ABC News cameraman on the front yard of the Supreme Court. And that night or the following night, there was a story in ABC News about this court that I sat on. And my public life, my whole life, had changed in an instant. And it was an instant that I witnessed, didn't participate in, I witnessed it. On the night before the grand jury was to come back, and I would have been testifying, my colleague, whose divorce was on appeal, resigned from the Supreme Court. The understanding was, as I was later told, that no criminal conduct would be charged, and he would leave. And this didn't play out in 2 days. This was a long time. And so when I heard that, I was very sad for him because he was a good person. He was a decent person. But it was over, I thought. You would think that. It's over now. A few days later, the Attorney General released his report to the public at 3 o'clock, had a press conference. His report was hand-carried to the Supreme Court the same hour so we could be reading it. And it made a number of serious accusations about the conduct of our court, not just that episode. The Attorney General then passed his report on to the state legislature. Turns out they wanted to pursue an impeachment investigation against all of us. So we decided to have a live press statement from the well of the Supreme Court room. WMUR Television, which is a statewide TV station, came up. A lot of reporters were there. And the then Chief Justice rightly denied the broad accusations that were being leveled at the court. But to be honest, nobody was listening. Nobody was listening. My public life was imploding. And the entire staff of our court was just visibly shaken by what was happening. It was front page news everywhere, everywhere. Editorials followed, and while I was not the principal target, I was certainly included. And after a few months, 1 or 2 newspapers in New Hampshire called for me to resign. And almost no one spoke up for us, the state in which I had lived at that time for 28 years. Even the people that knew us best were largely silent. And because the court was under attack, withering attack, almost every day in the media, I felt it best to step down until my name was cleared. But I wasn't sure it would be cleared. I knew I hadn't done anything to justify this, but everything else had taken its own turn. So it was hard for a judge to be castigated as unworthy, unethical, and sit. Stepping down from that bench for as long as 20 minutes under those circumstances was hugely painful. During my months off the bench, I felt really isolated, and nobody really wanted to talk to you because they're afraid they'd get in trouble if they did. And I wasn't much into seeing people. One story I remember, during my time off the bench, I was at the local bank, the drive-up window in Manchester, at 2 rows, and there was a car next to mine, And there was a woman on the passenger seat, and she was asking me to roll my window down. I had no idea who she was. And so I accommodated that, and I rolled the window down. She said, "Are you Justice Broderick?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And with real disdain in her voice, she snapped at me, "You should be ashamed of yourself for what you did." Now, there was no point in the drive-up window at the bank to explain to her what she thought was true wasn't true. But it was apparent to me that my reputation was being damaged, maybe irretrievably damaged. I didn't know this woman. She believed the speculation and the innuendo. And there were probably a lot of people like her, I thought, as I made that real long ride home. Maybe my public career really was in jeopardy. Maybe my reputation was gone. Maybe I should step down. But there seemed nothing I could do to stop the bleeding. Day after day after day. I had to wait my turn to testify. I would eventually be asked to come to the House Judiciary Committee to testify, but that would be months down the road. In the weeks that followed, my deposition was taken because the House Judiciary Committee hired a Boston lawyer, a very good lawyer, by the way. And so he deposed court personnel, he deposed me, he deposed the other judges. And every single day, I would read the paper, and there would be quotations from perfect strangers who were not in the room, who did not know me, who knew nothing other than what people were speculating about. And they would render these ethical opinions about me, about others. And sometimes they were from halfway across the United States. But they were described as ethics experts. It never ceased to amaze me how people who knew nothing seem to know everything. After 3 months off the bench and a lot of wake-ups at 3 a.m., and by the way, everything seems impossible at 3 a.m. 6 a.m. you can deal with it. 3 a.m. it's dark, it's impossible to deal with it. So after those months, I got a call from the chairman of the Judicial Conduct Committee. He told me that the committee had reviewed my conduct in detail surrounding that Friday in the conference room, but more broadly. And they'd come up with a decision, and I held my breath. I was expecting something terrible at that point. He told me there was insufficient evidence of wrongdoing on my part to investigate me any further. And would I like them to announce that publicly? I said, no, let's keep that a secret. Yeah, I said that'd be helpful, actually. It'd be very helpful. Having my name cleared by that group in that atmosphere was just remarkably helpful to me. So I said I'd be grateful if you'd release that finding and do it as quickly as you can. At that moment, I hoped it would help and that everything would finally be over. Within days of that call, there was a headline in the Union Leader saying that I'd been cleared of wrongdoing, I'd been exonerated. And a day later, it was like it never happened. Like it never happened. The process went on, the drumbeats continued. On the last day of June, I stepped down probably in February. On the last day of June, my turn came to drive to Concord to testify. I'd watched the hearings. I've been waiting for months for that day. The hearings had been painful to watch. People I knew, the Attorney General of the state, said to them he wasn't sure that he would believe me. Said that on statewide television. He didn't know anything about what went on at that courthouse. But finally, it was my turn, and I will always remember that morning when my wife and I drove there. And this may seem odd to you, but and it wasn't planned, but that day as I was shaving to get ready, I was thinking of that young boy, me, and John F. Kennedy. I was thinking of that young boy who had been inspired years earlier to public service, and I was thinking of my family, and I had no idea how things would turn out. So you had two choices. One was to quit, and one was to persevere. And not because I was particularly strong, my wife's stronger than I am, but the inspiration of those people that I admired, they wouldn't have quit either. But maybe my career in public service would be over. Maybe it would end just like Richard Nixon's. If it didn't, I thought maybe I'm so damaged I should just leave anyway. Maybe I'll get through it, be cleared, and then leave the court. The last 5 months had taken a toll on my family. Before the hearings began that morning, the place was just chaotic. The lawyer, the committee's lawyer who had taken my deposition all those months earlier, and he was going to start the questioning that day, and then the committee members could ask me questions. And so he came over to me and said, "Judge, can I see you for a minute?" I said, "Sure." He had a home in Keene. He said to me, it's almost a direct quote, "I was thinking as I was driving over here this morning, Judge, what I would have done differently if I had been you." He said, "I couldn't think of anything, to be honest. When this is over, I'd like you to go back on the bench. That's where you belong," he said to me. If you'd put a bow on that, that was the best gift I could have ever received at the worst moment of my professional and personal life. I remember saying to him, "I'll go back if I'm given the chance." I'd always been grateful that he shared that with me because he knew the case as well as anyone. He spent months building it. So I testified for hours on live television, live radio. My wife sat behind me. And some of the members of the committee, by the way, clearly were not in my camp. And near the end of it, to be honest, I was pretty weary of it. And in response to a question relating to the time it had taken me and my colleagues to report this perceived misconduct, which was 5 or 6 days. We had 2 years to do it, by the way. But some of them were concerned that I didn't do it that afternoon. And I remember saying to one of the senators, or one of the House members, if my professional career was so wounded that it might come to an end, I would hope my colleagues would have a few sleepless nights too. And then I couldn't stop myself. I said, I don't apologize for what I did. I'm at peace with it. If this committee doesn't think I have the character and ethics to serve on the state Supreme Court, then you should vote to remove me. That's what this hearing's about. And then I thought, should I have said that? But I was glad I said it. I was honest. And I knew I had thrown down a challenge, but somehow I felt complete. I'd kept the faith. My own and my family's. I remember saying to him that day, I said, I'm John T. Broderick, Jr. I have my father's name. I knew public service would have its tough days, but in my wildest imagination, I never imagined that moment. In the end, the committee took 4 votes, from admonition to reprimand to impeachment. And when they did that, I was not there. Obviously, it was several weeks later. My wife and I and my son, who was then in his mid-20s, we were driving in Manchester, and we had the radio on. It was carried on public radio. And we pulled over to a tree-lined street in Manchester on the curb. And I listened to my name and my entire professional life being discussed. So they had these 4 different votes, and each member voted in succession. And when the votes were tallied, I'd won by large majorities. on all those things. And my wife and 26-year-old son started to cry. And they thought it was over. I knew it wasn't over. Because the committee would make a recommendation, would go to the entire House of Representatives. They would decide whether impeachment would be justified. They would vote, ultimately. And a week or so later, they did. Our television had broken, and so I couldn't watch it. So we listened to it on public radio. And I won by a very small number of votes, despite the Judicial Conduct Committee, despite the Judiciary Committee. If 15 or 18 people had voted the other way, I would have been impeached. I remember getting a phone call that night, it must have been 10:30 at night, from then Senator Joe Biden, who I'd known for years. I love Joe Biden. He's so authentically real and genuine. I didn't expect to get his phone call at 10:30 at night. And he said, "Congratulations," he said, "you just won your first term on the Hampshire Supreme Court." His call meant the world to my wife and me that night, and I will never, ever, ever forget it. But the Chief Justice of our court was impeached by the House. As someone said to me that night, if they had put his name forward to be publicly lynched, it would have passed. I'd never seen anything like it. So in late September of that year, I testified at his impeachment trial. So I was back in it. And that was carried live on television and radio. And after 2 weeks or so, he was overwhelmingly acquitted by the Senate. It had been just an amazingly agonizing journey for him and his family. He's a decent man who made a mistake. He served previously as United States Attorney, and he served proudly in the United States Marine Corps. He was a good man. The most painful part of the whole experience, though, all these months, happened as I was leaving the Senate hearing room, having finished my testimony. It had been just months of unspeakable anguish for me and my family, for the court staff, for friends. But the moment I'm going to describe to you is seared in my mind as if it happened yesterday. A member of the House Judiciary Committee, they were managing the Senate trial. This fellow had served on the House Judiciary Committee that heard 23 days of testimony. And I knew him and liked him and I respected him. So as I was leaving the chamber, having testified, he walked me out. He put his hand on my right shoulder, kind of casually, like a friend would do. He said to me, "Did anyone explain the impeachment vote against you, Judge?" And he asked me that in kind of a casual way that a friend might say something. I said, "No, actually, Jack, they never did," hoping he would tell me. But I wasn't going to ask him. He quickly added in a very matter-of-fact tone, "I can tell you in one word, Judge." Now picture this person, who he is, what he knows, and what he's saying. "I can tell you in one word, Judge." "What's that?" I said. "Claremont," he said with a sly grin. Claremont was code for the public school funding cases, where our court had told the legislature it was not meeting its constitutional obligation to fund public education. Should I feel good about that, Jack? Oh, I don't know if you should feel good about it, Judge, but it's the truth. They had a shot at your head and they took it. It wasn't personal. Funny, I said, it sure felt personal. Neither he nor anyone has ever said publicly what he told me privately, but I will never, ever, ever forget it. I survived and went back to work on the court for another decade. 7 of those years as Chief Justice. America's a great country, right? One minute you're under impeachment, next minute you're Chief Justice. It's a great country. One afternoon, years after the impeachment was in the rearview mirror, a former president of the New Hampshire Bar came to see me. This is 5 or 6 years after the impeachment's over. I didn't know why he wanted to see me. I knew him. He said, "I've come to apologize for things I said about you when that was going on. I realize now that I didn't really have the right information, and I shouldn't have questioned your ethics." I accepted his apology. I admired him for doing it, and it helped me heal. Last fall, they unveiled a portrait of me that hangs in the Supreme Court courtroom in Concord. And it was a pretty humbling experience, as you might imagine. And the day we were there and the day they were unveiling the portrait, I was very proud. Not that I had served, but that I hadn't left. That I hadn't left. And it was my family, my family's history, and people who inspired me as a young person who kept me there. Little did John F. Kennedy ever think that he's one of the reasons I had stepped down. But he wouldn't have. Those heroes from my younger life mattered to me. Their amazing perseverance in public life inspired me. And I was very grateful that it had. When I returned to the court after all of that, I really wondered how I'd feel about it. Maybe I should leave. My wife would not hear that. She said, "That's not happening." But I wondered whether my zest for public service would die, having been through that process. I expected it might, actually, but it never left. Most importantly, I never grew bitter about it, because what would be the point? And when I went back on the court, I was sometimes designated to go over and testify for the court on issues affecting the court system or its funding. And for a short time, I would always check to see who was on the committee and how they voted on me, whether they voted to impeach me or not. And then I thought, what is the point? I know what happened. I don't need to check their votes. And so I didn't do it anymore. Didn't seem relevant to me. I really loved my public service, and I was privileged to have served on the court, and I would gladly do it again, but my eyes would be wide open. I'd have a better understanding of the uncertainties of public life and the intentions of other people. When I left the court, I went to law school, became dean of the law school at UNH, and then subsequently moved to the Rudman Center, which we had founded when I was dean. And Warren Rudman had been our senior senator for a while. He'd been our attorney general. He was a remarkable person. And my goal was to have young people be inspired to public service, not blindly, but intelligently inspired to public service. I look out in the broad world of people in public life today. There are some outstanding people there. Not as many as I remember from my childhood. But I hope those who are not measuring up don't frighten young people away from public life. I'm as committed to public service for others as I was for myself all those years ago. And I have witnessed its power to effect fundamental change in civil rights, women's rights, and human rights, both here and around the world. And I have personally experienced its exhilaration and, sadly, its dark side. But I still believe that, speaking to the students, your generation has the same obligation my generation had decades ago, and that is to move the needle on human rights. And public service is not a bad way to try. But I can tell you it's not for the faint of heart or the easily discouraged, but it can change your life. But more importantly, it allows you to change the lives of other people. Sometimes making a difference is more important than a big salary. It's usually more important. Just want to close with a brief story. I recommend a book that's called Devil in the Grove. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's about Thurgood Marshall, who served on the U.S. Supreme Court, who argued Brown versus Board of Education. And it talks about his years as the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the cases he tried on behalf of African Americans, usually in the South or the Southwest, who've been charged with capital crimes. I don't know how people like that are made or where they come from, but he is a remarkable person. When you read the book, you think, what have I done in my life? Just extraordinary. He was almost hanged once or twice himself, merely for representing an African American charged with crime. And the courts in which a lot of these people were tried were just corrupt. Justice was not the goal. Conviction was the purpose. And having been a lawyer my whole life, I recognized in reading that book, and that's why I encourage people to become lawyers, or judges, or legislators. From 1949, when they were lynching people in Florida, and young kids were paraded out in their Sunday best to be photographed with a corpse hanging from a tree limb. This is during my lifetime, and it's talked about in that book. To that cold January day in 2009, when Barack Obama raised his right hand, also in my lifetime. Doctors in our society have made great advances in healthcare. Scientists have taken us to the moon and beyond. But the profession that changed the face of this country more than any other was the legal profession. Lawyers, judges, legislators made that happen in a way that nobody else did. There's no Thurgood Marshall in civil rights who's a doctor or a scientist or a college professor. Lawyers made those changes. And a lot of them did it at great personal sacrifice. So if anyone's interested in becoming a lawyer, I recommend it. It's a great profession. Again, let me close. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for the privilege of being here at Dartmouth. Thank you very much.